The pristine walls of St. Mary's Hospital's VIP maternity suite did little to mask the tension in the air. Brittany Caldwell, daughter of Mayor Richard Caldwell and self-proclaimed socialite, reclined on her designer hospital bed, her perfectly manicured nails tapping an impatient rhythm on the Egyptian cotton sheets. "Where is that useless nurse?" Brittany hissed, her eyes narrowing as she glanced at the Rolex on her wrist. "I swear the service in this place is worse than the Hilton." As if on cue, Susan Matthews shuffled into the room. At 65, with her steel gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and crow's feet etched deeply around her kind eyes, Susan was the picture of a veteran nurse. Her hands, gnarled from decades of service, clutched a clipboard. "Good morning, Mrs. Caldwell," Susan said softly. "How are you feeling today?" Brittany's lip curled in disgust. "How am I feeling? I'm feeling like I'm surrounded by incompetence. Where's my baby's bottle? Don't tell me you forgot it again, you senile old bat." Susan took a deep breath, willing herself to remain calm. "Mrs. Caldwell, I was hoping we could discuss feeding options. Have you considered breastfeeding? It's really the best." "Breastfeeding?" Brittany interrupted with a shrill laugh. "Are you insane? Do you have any idea what that would do to my figure? No, I need a bottle of formula, the expensive European kind, not that cheap garbage you usually try to pass off." Susan nodded, her heart heavy. In her 45 years as a nurse, she'd seen countless mothers like Brittany, more concerned with their appearance than their child's well-being, but she'd never get used to it. "Of course, Mrs. Caldwell, I'll fetch that right away." As Susan turned to leave, Brittany's voice stopped her cold. "And try not to take all day this time. I swear, at the rate you move, you'll be in a nursing home yourself before you make it back." Susan's shoulders slumped as she left the room, Brittany's cruel laughter echoing behind her. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall, fighting back tears. She thought of her husband, Frank, waiting at home. His medication was getting more expensive by the day, and without this job, no, she couldn't afford to dwell on that now. Squaring her shoulders, Susan headed to the nursery to prepare Brittany's bottle, praying for the strength to make it through another day. Susan's hands trembled slightly as she measured out the precise amount of formula, European import, just as Brittany had demanded. The price of a single can could feed a family for a week, but heaven forbid the mayor's daughter settle for anything less than the best. As she shook the bottle, ensuring the powder was fully dissolved, Susan's mind wandered to her own children, both grown now, with families of their own. She remembered the quiet nights spent nursing them, the bond that formed as she cradled them close. How different from Brittany's cold, detached approach to motherhood. With a sigh, Susan tested the formula's temperature on her wrist. Perfect. Not too hot, not too cold. She made her way back to Brittany's room, steeling herself for another barrage of insults. Finally, Brittany snapped as Susan entered. "I was beginning to think you'd gotten lost on your way to the retirement home." Susan forced a smile. "Here you are, Mrs. Caldwell. I've made sure it's the perfect temperature for the baby." Brittany snatched the bottle from Susan's hands, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. "Perfect temperature? Please, I bet it's scalding. Are you trying to burn my precious angel's mouth?" Before Susan could protest, Brittany unscrewed the cap and stuck her finger in the formula. Her face contorted in exaggerated disgust. "I knew it. This is way too hot. Are you completely incompetent? Or are you just trying to hurt my baby on purpose?" Something inside Susan snapped. 45 years of patience, of turning the other cheek, of weathering abuse from entitled patients. It all came crashing down in an instant. Without a word, Susan plucked the bottle from Brittany's hands. For a moment, Brittany looked triumphant, clearly expecting an apology and a promise to remake the formula. Instead, Susan unscrewed the cap fully and upended the entire contents over Brittany's perfectly coiffed head. Lukewarm formula ran down Brittany's face, dripping onto her designer hospital gown. For a split second, the room was silent, save for the soft plop of formula hitting the sheets. "There," Susan said, her voice eerily calm. "Now you know it's not too hot. Next time, you can prepare it yourself." Brittany's shriek of outrage followed Susan as she strode out of the room, her head held high. As the door closed behind her, Susan heard Brittany screaming threats about lawsuits and ruined reputation. But for the first time in years, Susan felt free. The walk to Dr. Michael Harper's office felt like a march to the gallows. Susan's momentary elation at standing up to Brittany had faded, replaced by a gnawing dread. What had she been thinking? She'd assaulted a patient, the mayor's daughter, no less. There was no way she'd keep her job after this. As she approached the imposing oak door with Dr. Michael Harper, hospital director, emblazoned in gold letters, Susan's mind raced. How would she tell Frank? His medication was already stretching their budget to the breaking point. Without her salary, Susan knocked softly, her heart pounding. "Enter," came a stern voice from within. Dr. Harper sat behind an impressive mahogany desk, his face a mask of disapproval. At 35, he was young for a hospital director, but his piercing blue eyes held an intensity that made him seem older. "Sit down, Mrs. Matthews," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Susan lowered herself into the seat, feeling every one of her 65 years. "I assume you know why you're here," Dr. Harper began, his tone clipped. Susan nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "Yes, sir, it's about Mrs. Caldwell, isn't it?" "Indeed." Dr. Harper leaned forward, his fingers steepled. "Mrs. Matthews, I've just gotten off the phone with Mayor Caldwell." To say he's furious would be an understatement. He's demanding your immediate termination and considering legal action against the hospital. Susan felt the blood drain from her face. "Dr. Harper, please, I know what I did was wrong, but you have to understand." "Understand what?" Dr. Harper interrupted. "That you poured formula over a patient's head? That you potentially jeopardized this hospital's reputation and funding? Do you have any idea the position you've put me in?" Tears welled in Susan's eyes. "I'm so sorry. It won't happen again, I promise. Please, I need this job. My husband." "Your personal circumstances are not my concern, Mrs. Matthews," Dr. Harper said coldly. "What concerns me is the smooth operation of this hospital and the satisfaction of our patients. And right now you've made that job significantly more difficult." As Dr. Harper continued his lecture, Susan's mind wandered. She thought of Frank waiting at home, unaware that their world was about to come crashing down. She thought of the decades she'd given to this hospital, the countless lives she'd touched, all undone in a moment of weakness. Absently, she reached into her pocket, pulling out the small handkerchief she always carried. As she dabbed at her eyes, she didn't notice Dr. Harper's sudden silence, his gaze fixed on the faded makeup bag from which she'd withdrawn the handkerchief. Dr. Michael Harper's stern reprimand died on his lips as his eyes locked onto the small makeup bag in Susan's hands. It was old, the fabric worn and faded, but the red star embroidered on its surface was still vibrant, a splash of color against the drab hospital walls. "That bag," he said, his voice suddenly hoarse. "Where did you get it?" Susan looked up, confusion replacing the fear in her eyes. "This? I've had it for years. My mother made it for me when I was a girl." Dr. Harper stood abruptly, circling the desk to get a closer look. "May I?" he asked, reaching for the bag with trembling hands. Bewildered, Susan handed it over. Dr. Harper turned it over in his hands, his fingers tracing the star's outline. When he looked up, his eyes were shining with unshed tears. "Mrs. Matthews," he said softly, "do you remember a little boy about 30 years ago? A boy you saved from a very bad situation?" Susan's brow furrowed as she cast her mind back. Suddenly her eyes widened in recognition. "The gypsy camp," she whispered. "The little boy from the newspaper. But how could you know about that?" Dr. Harper sank to his knees beside Susan's chair, clutching the makeup bag to his chest. "Because I was that little boy," he said, his voice cracking. "You saved me, Mrs. Matthews. You saved my life." The office faded away as memories flooded back, transporting them both to a time 3 decades past. The rhythmic clacking of train wheels filled the night air, as 5-year-old Mike Harper pressed his face against the cool glass of the window. His father, George, sat beside him, 2 oversized duffel bags stuffed with merchandise at their feet. "Look, Mikey," George said, pointing to the twinkling lights of a distant city. "That's where we're headed, the Big Apple. If we play our cards right, we might just hit the jackpot this trip." Mike nodded, excitement bubbling in his chest. He loved these trips with his dad, loved watching him wheel and deal, turning a pocketful of change into a fortune. As the train pulled into the station, George hoisted the bags onto his broad shoulders. "Stay close, kiddo," he warned. "This ain't exactly Disneyland." They made their way through the crowded platform. Mike's small hand clutched tightly in his father's. Neither noticed the dark-eyed man watching them intently from the shadows. Later, as they rested on a bench waiting for their connection, the man approached. "Pardon me," he said, his accent thick and musical. "I couldn't help but notice your bags. You wouldn't happen to be a merchant, would you?" George's eyes lit up at the prospect of a sale. "That I am, friend. Name's George Harper. What can I interest you in?" The man who introduced himself as Ramon produced a small jar of golden liquid. "Perhaps a trade?" "This is the finest honey you'll ever taste. Made by my own bees?" George hesitated, but Ramon's smooth words and winning smile soon had him agreeing to a sample. As George dipped a finger into the jar, Mike's eyelids grew heavy. The last thing he remembered was his father's head lolling to the side, a look of peaceful contentment on his face. When Mike awoke, he was in a strange, colorful tent. The acrid smell of smoke filled his nostrils, and unfamiliar voices chattered in a language he didn't understand. "Papa?" he called out, his voice small and frightened. Ramon's face appeared, his kind smile now twisted into something sinister. "Your papa is gone, little one," he said. "But don't worry, you're part of our family now." The next month was a blur of fear and confusion for Mike. Every day, Ramon or one of the other adults would take him to busy street corners or crowded markets. They taught him to beg, to look pitiful, to tug at the heartstrings of passers-by. "Remember," Ramon would say, his grip painfully tight on Mike's shoulder. "If you try to run or tell anyone the truth, we'll find you and then we'll have to punish you. You don't want that, do you?" Mike shook his head, tears streaming down his dirty cheeks. He wanted his mom and dad. He wanted to go home. But as the days turned into weeks, hope began to fade. Maybe this was his home now. Maybe no one was coming to save him. The marketplace bustled with activity, a cacophony of voices haggling over prices and hawking wares. Susan Matthews navigated the crowded aisles, her basket filled with fresh produce. It was her and Frank's 5th wedding anniversary, and she was planning a special dinner. As she examined a display of ripe tomatoes, a small voice caught her attention. "Spare some change, miss, please?" Susan turned to see a young boy, no more than 5 or 6, his clothes dirty and his eyes downcast. Her heart clenched at the sight. In a town this size, it wasn't uncommon to see people down on their luck, but a child this young. "Where are your parents, sweetie?" she asked gently. The boy's eyes darted nervously to the side, where a swarthy man stood watching intently. I don't have any," he mumbled. Something about the boy nagged at Susan's memory. She'd seen his face before. She was sure of it. But where? Suddenly it hit her. The newspaper Frank had brought home from his business trip. There had been an article about a missing boy, kidnapped from a train station. The photo, Susan's heart raced. Could it be? She crouched down, meeting the boy's eyes. "What's your name, honey?" The boy hesitated, his gaze flicking again to the man watching them. "Mike," he whispered. It was him. Susan's mind whirled. What should she do? Call the police? But if she did, the boy's captors might spirit him away before help arrived. Making a split-second decision, Susan reached into her purse and pulled out her old makeup bag. The red star on its surface, a relic from her younger, more idealistic days, seemed to wink at her. "Mike," she said softly, "I'm going to help you, but you have to be very brave. Can you do that?" The boy nodded, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Susan stood, making a show of rummaging through her makeup bag. "Oh, I think I have some change in here somewhere," she said loudly, then in a whisper. "When I count to 3, take my hand and run, okay?" Mike gave an almost imperceptible nod. 1. Susan's fingers closed around her house keys. 2. She tensed, ready to sprint. 3. In one fluid motion, Susan grabbed Mike's hand and took off running. She heard shouts behind them, angry voices in a language she didn't understand. But she didn't look back, didn't slow down. Her legs pumped furiously, her lungs burning as she pulled Mike through the winding market aisles. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, they burst out onto the main street. Susan's beat-up Chevy was just a few yards away. "Get in," she gasped, fumbling with her keys. As they peeled away from the curb, Susan caught sight of Ramon in her rearview mirror, his face contorted with rage. But he was too late. They were safe. The drive home was a blur. Mike, exhausted and overwhelmed, fell asleep almost immediately. Susan's mind raced. What would Frank say? What should they do next? Call the police? The boy's parents? As she pulled into her driveway, Frank emerged from the house, a quizzical expression on his face. "Honey," he called. "What's going on? Who's that in the car?" Susan took a deep breath. "Frank, remember that missing boy from the newspaper? I think I just found him." The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. Police cars with flashing lights filled the quiet suburban street. Neighbors peered curiously from behind curtains, whispering speculation about the commotion at the Matthews house. Inside, Mike sat on the couch, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, and a mug of hot chocolate clutched in his small hands. Susan hovered nearby, her maternal instincts in overdrive. "You did the right thing, Mrs. Matthews," Detective Johnson assured her for the 10th time. "We've been searching for this boy for weeks. His parents are on their way now." As if on cue, the sound of screeching tires filled the air. Moments later, the front door burst open, revealing a frantic couple, George and Helen Harper. "Mike!" Helen cried, rushing forward. Mike's eyes lit up. "Mommy! Daddy!" For a moment, the room was filled with the joyous sounds of reunion. Helen sobbed as she clutched Mike to her chest, while George wrapped his arms around them both, tears streaming down his face. Susan and Frank stood back, watching the scene with misty eyes. Despite the chaos and uncertainty of the day, seeing this family reunited made it all worthwhile. But as the initial wave of emotion subsided, the atmosphere in the room subtly shifted. George's eyes narrowed as he surveyed Susan and Frank, a hint of suspicion creeping into his expression. "So," he said, his voice gruff, "you're the ones who found our boy, huh?" Susan nodded, smiling. "Yes, I recognized him from the newspaper article. I'm just so glad we could help reunite your family." George exchanged a glance with Helen, who was still holding Mike tightly. "And you just happened to spot him in the market? Just like that?" The accusatory tone in his voice made Susan's smile falter. "Well, yes. I mean, it was pure chance, really." Pure chance?" George interrupted, his voice rising. "Or maybe you were in on it from the beginning? Maybe this whole rescue was just a setup to make yourselves look like heroes?" Susan gasped, shocked by the accusation. "What? No. How could you even think?" "George," Helen murmured, placing a hand on her husband's arm. But he shook her off, his face flushing with anger. "Do you have any idea what we've been through?" he shouted. "A month of hell, not knowing if our boy was alive or dead. And now you expect us to believe you just happened to stumble across him? I wasn't born yesterday, lady." Frank stepped forward, his normally gentle demeanor hardening. "Now wait just a minute. My wife risked her own safety to save your son. You should be thanking her, not accusing her of—" "Thanking her?" George scoffed. "For what? Being part of a kidnapping ring?" "Detective," he turned to the officer, "I want these people arrested. They're clearly involved in my son's abduction." The room erupted into chaos. Susan burst into tears, overwhelmed by the cruel twist of fate. Frank argued vehemently with George, while Helen tried to calm both her husband and the still frightened Mike. The detective attempted to restore order, his voice barely audible over the shouting. In the midst of the commotion, no one noticed Mike tugging on his father's sleeve, trying to explain that Susan and Frank were good people, that they had saved him. His small voice was drowned out by the adults' anger and accusations. As the police reluctantly began to question Susan and Frank, treating them now as suspects rather than good Samaritans, Susan felt her world crumbling around her. How had their act of kindness turned into this nightmare? Little did she know, this painful memory would resurface decades later, bringing with it an unexpected chance at redemption. Dr. Michael Harper's office fell silent as the weight of the past settled over them. Susan sat frozen, her mind reeling from the flood of memories. Dr. Harper, little Mike, all grown up, still knelt before her, clutching her old makeup bag like a lifeline. "All these years," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I've been searching for you, to thank you, to make things right." Susan shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "But your parents, they accused us of being involved. They wanted us arrested." Dr. Harper's face crumpled with shame. "I know, God, I know. I was so young, so scared. I tried to tell them the truth, but no one would listen to me. By the time I was old enough to understand what had really happened, to try and find you, you were gone." He stood, moving behind his desk to pull out a thick file. "I've had private investigators searching for years, but you'd moved, changed jobs. It was like chasing a ghost. And now here you are." working in my hospital all this time. Susan's mind whirled. But the reprimand. You were going to fire me. Dr. Harper's eyes widened in horror. Fire you? God, no. I had no idea it was you when I called you in here. I was just going through the motions, following protocol. But now, he trailed off, a determined look settling on his face. Now everything changes, he declared. Susan, Mrs. Matthews, I owe you everything. My life, my career, the family I've built. None of it would have been possible without your bravery that day in the market. He picked up his phone, punching in a number with decisive clicks. Janet, cancel all my appointments for the day and get me Mayor Caldwell on the line immediately. Susan gasped. Dr. Harper, you don't have to. He held up a hand, silencing her protest. Please call me Michael. And yes, I do have to. It's long past time I repaid my debt to you. Over the next hour, Susan watched in awe as Michael masterfully handled the situation. He spoke to the mayor, firmly but respectfully explaining the circumstances and making it clear that not only would Susan keep her job, but she would be promoted to head nurse with a substantial raise. And if that's not acceptable to you, Mr. Mayor, Michael said, his voice still, I'll be happy to hold a press conference explaining exactly why one of our most dedicated nurses was being unfairly targeted. I'm sure the voters would be very interested in that story. By the time he hung up, the mayor had not only backed down from his demands for Susan's termination, but had also agreed to make a sizable donation to the hospital's education fund. Michael turned to Susan, a wide smile on his face. Well, that's taken care of. Now about your husband's medical needs. Before Susan could process what was happening, Michael had arranged for Frank to receive top-notch treatment at the country's leading cardiac care center. All expenses paid. It's the least I can do, he insisted when Susan tried to gwazzing. You saved my life, Mrs. Matthews. Let me help save your husband's. As the day drew to a close, Susan found herself walking out of the hospital in a daze. The events of the past few hours felt like a dream, a wonderful, impossible dream. Frank was waiting for her in the parking lot, concern etched on his weathered face. Well, he asked anxiously. What happened? Do we need to start looking for a new job? Susan smiled, taking his hand in hers. No, dear, we don't. In fact, I think our luck has finally changed. As they drove home, Susan recounted the incredible turn of events. Frank listened in amazement, occasionally shaking his head in disbelief. You know, he said as they pulled into their driveway, I always told you your kindness would be repaid someday. Looks like that day finally came. Susan nodded, her heart full. She thought of little Mike, scared and alone in that marketplace all those years ago. She thought of Dr. Michael Harper, the successful, compassionate man he'd become. And she thought of all the twists and turns of fate that had brought them back together. You're right, she said softly. It just goes to show a little kindness can change everything, even if it takes 30 years to come full circle. As they walked hand in hand into their home, Susan felt a peace she hadn't known in years. The future, which had seemed so bleak just that morning, now shone with promise. And it was all because of a simple act of kindness, a red star on an old makeup bag, and the enduring power of the human spirit.